A German scholar said he found the oldest complete Bible in the world lying in a basket of old parchment that was waiting to be burned. The monks who owned it have been disputing that sentence ever since. This is the story of the Codex Sinaiticus, what it is, where it came from, how it left a monastery in the Sinai desert, and why it ended up split between 4 buildings in 4 countries. We will look at who wrote it, and when, at the man who took it, and what he said he was doing at the sale that moved it to London, and at what the book itself actually says when you open it. Some of that last part surprises people, and it is worth staying for. Start with the object, because everything else follows from what it physically is. The Codex Sinaiticus is a Greek Bible, written by hand on prepared animal skin in the middle of the 4th century after Christ. That places it within a generation or 2 of the Council of Nicaea, and roughly 300 years after the events it describes. It is the oldest surviving complete copy of the New Testament. Not the oldest fragment of the New Testament, which is a much smaller and much earlier scrap of papyrus. The oldest complete one. Every book, from Matthew to Revelation, in one binding, written out in full by people who sat down to do it while the Roman Empire was still standing. To see why that matters, you have to know what scholars had before it. For centuries, the printed Greek New Testament rested on manuscripts from the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. Those are careful copies made by devoted men, and they are also copies of copies of copies, 1,000 years downstream of the writing. Sinaiticus cut that distance roughly in half at a stroke. It is the difference between hearing a story from someone who heard it from their grandmother and hearing it from the grandmother. It was made to last, and it did. The pages are parchment, which is to say skin, scraped and stretched and dried until it takes ink. Papyrus rots. Parchment does not, provided it stays dry, and the Sinai desert is one of the driest inhabited places on earth. That is not a coincidence. It is most of the reason the book still exists at all. For something like 1,500 years, it stayed in one place. The monastery of St. Catherine, at the foot of the mountain the tradition calls Sinai, in the wilderness where the book of Exodus says Moses was given the law. Then, in the middle of the 19th century, it left. And here is the question this whole story comes down to, so put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. A visiting scholar left that monastery with the oldest complete Bible in the world, and a piece of paper the monks say was never a sale. So was that a rescue, or was it a taking? See whether you still think the same thing by the end. Take the book first, before the argument about it. It was written out in Greek, in capital letters, with almost no spaces between the words and very little punctuation. That is simply how books were made then. Reading it is a skill, and a reader in the 4th century would have been trained to it in the way a musician is trained to sight read. The pages are laid out in 4 narrow columns. That is unusual and rather beautiful, and it is one of the ways scholars can identify a stray leaf as belonging to this manuscript and no other. Most great codices use 2 columns. Sinaiticus opens like a wall of text in 4 vertical bands, and when a page lies flat, the 8 columns across the spread are said to resemble a strip of an older scroll unrolled. The whole book, when it was complete, would have run to something like 730 leaves. Around 400 survive. That means we have most of it, and we have lost a great deal of it, which is roughly the condition of everything that has come to us from the ancient world. Think for a moment about what that pile of skin cost. A single leaf takes a substantial piece of hide. 700 leaves means a herd. Add the labor of preparing the parchment, the ink, the years of a trained scribe's time, and the binding, and you are looking at something closer in value to a house than to a book. Nobody made a manuscript like this casually. Somebody with real money commissioned it, and they commissioned it in the decades right after Christianity stopped being illegal in the Roman Empire. And it is not only a New Testament. Sinaiticus began as a complete Bible, and the larger part of it by volume was the Old Testament in Greek. The translation known as the Septuagint, the version the earliest Christians actually read, and the version quoted in the New Testament itself. Much of that Old Testament portion is lost, but what survives includes books that are in some Bibles and not in others, among them Tobit, Judith, and the books of the Maccabees. That tells you something quietly important about the community that made it. They were not assembling a minimum. They were making the fullest, most generous copy of the scriptures they could put their hands on, and binding it into one enormous volume, at a time when a Christian could still meet people who remembered the persecutions. There is a theory about that which is worth stating carefully, because it is attractive and it is not proven. The historian Eusebius records that the Emperor Constantine ordered 50 copies of the scriptures to be prepared for the churches of his new capital. Some scholars have wondered whether Sinaiticus is one of them, or at least one of that generation of imperial quality Bibles. It is possible. It has never been demonstrated, and careful people say so. What is certain is the workmanship. The text was written by a small team of scribes working in the same house, in hands that specialists can tell apart. Their individual habits are visible. One is a better speller than another. One is more generous with space. One has a particular way of shaping a letter at the end of a line. And they made mistakes, which is the part that makes the book feel human rather than holy in an untouchable way. They repeated lines. They skipped lines. They wrote a word twice. Somebody sitting in the same room caught many of those errors and corrected them straight away. The commonest error in any hand-copied book is the eye jumping. A scribe reads a line ending in a particular word, looks down to his own page to write it, looks back up, and his eye lands on a later line that happens to end in the same word. Everything between the two disappears, without him ever knowing. That single mechanical accident accounts for a great deal of the variation between ancient manuscripts, and it has nothing to do with anybody's opinions about anything. Which is why the corrections are the interesting part rather than the embarrassing part. A team that catches its own eye jumps is a team that is reading the exemplar back against the copy, line by line, on purpose. Then, over the following centuries, more people corrected it again. Sinaiticus carries something in the order of 27,000 corrections, made by different hands across hundreds of years, in different inks. Somebody in the 6th or 7th century went through it systematically and brought the text into line with what was then the standard reading. Stop and consider what that actually shows, because it is the opposite of what people assume when they hear the word corrections. It is not evidence that the text was unstable. It is evidence that generations of people cared enormously whether it was right and kept checking, and kept a record of their checking on the page itself, where anybody could see it and disagree. A manuscript with no corrections is a manuscript nobody read closely. There is one more feature of the book that surprises people, and it is a matter of what is bound inside it. After the book of Revelation, Sinaiticus continues. It contains the epistle of Barnabas, and then part of a long 2nd century work called the Shepherd of Hermas. Neither of those is in anybody's Bible today. They were widely read, widely respected, and in some churches they were read aloud in worship. And in the 4th century, the question of exactly which books belonged and which did not was still being settled. Sinaiticus is a photograph of that moment. It shows a church that had entirely settled on the 4 Gospels and Paul, and that was still deciding about the edges. That is history you can hold in your hand, and it is why the manuscript matters far beyond the argument about who owns it. It also quietly answers a charge that gets made a great deal, which is that the Bible was assembled at a council by a committee acting on orders. Sinaiticus is older than any list anybody could have been ordered to follow, and what it shows is a church that had long since made up its mind about the center and was still thinking about the margins. Nobody imposed the 4 Gospels on this scribe. He wrote them out because they were what the church he belonged to read. And notice which way the uncertainty runs. The disputed material is at the back, after Revelation, and it consists of 2 edifying early Christian writings that eventually fell out. There is no 5th Gospel in here. There is nothing anyone later suppressed. What the oldest complete Bible in the world contains is slightly more than your Bible, not less, and the extra is a letter and a sermon. Now the man. Konstantin von Tischendorf was a German biblical scholar, born in 1815 in Saxony, and he had one obsession that ran his whole life. He believed that the oldest copies of the New Testament were still out there, sitting unread in the libraries of ancient monasteries, and that finding them would let scholars get closer to the original wording than anyone had been since the ancient world. He was right about that, and it is worth saying plainly that he was one of the great manuscript hunters of the 19th century. He traveled constantly. He read Greek at extraordinary speed, and he recovered texts that everybody else had given up on. His first great feat was a book called the Codex Ephraemi. Parchment was expensive, so a scribe short of material would sometimes take an old manuscript, scrape the writing off, and write something new on the reused skin. The old text does not vanish, it leaves a ghost. Tischendorf sat with that book and read the erased 5th century Bible underneath a later set of sermons, letter by letter, and published it. He was in his 20s. Understand what was driving him, because it was not adventure. The printed Greek New Testament that every scholar in Europe worked from descended from an edition Erasmus had put together in 1516, in a hurry, from a handful of late medieval manuscripts that happened to be within reach of him in Basel. It was a fine piece of work for its moment. It was also built on the newest evidence rather than the oldest, and everyone knew it. Tischendorf's life's project was to replace that foundation with something older, and to do it he had to go and find the old copies himself. In 1844, he arrived at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai. He was 29 years old. It is worth picturing the place, because the isolation is the reason the book survived, and also the reason the argument about it is so hard. St. Catherine's sits in a bowl of red mountains, reached in the 19th century by camel across desert, days from anywhere. Its walls are fortress walls. For a long period, there was no ground-level door at all, and visitors were hauled up the outside in a basket on a rope, which is a detail worth holding on to given what the rest of this story turns on. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited monasteries in the world. Monks have prayed there without a break since the 6th century, and the library they built is second only to the Vatican's in the age and importance of its Christian manuscripts. This was not a forgotten shed. It was, and is, a serious institution that had been keeping books for longer than most European countries have existed. This is where the basket comes in. Tischendorf's own account, published years later, says that he saw a basket of old parchment leaves which he was told were to be used to feed the fire, and that he recognized in them the oldest Greek writing he had ever seen. He was given 43 of those leaves. He took them back to Germany, presented them to his royal patron, and they sit in the university library at Leipzig to this day. The monastery has always rejected that description. The monk's position, then and now, is that the library was not in the habit of burning its manuscripts, that a community which had preserved a book for 1500 years is not plausibly on the point of destroying it, and that the basket story was a piece of self-flattery by a visitor who wanted to look like a rescuer. You are free to judge that. What is not in doubt is that in 1844, Tischendorf left the Sinai with 43 leaves of the oldest Bible in the world, and that the rest of the book stayed where it was. Consider the position he had put the monastery in. A foreign visitor had taken 43 leaves of something, gone home, and announced to the learned world that this library contained treasure. Whatever the monks thought of the basket story, they now knew that every scholar in Europe had been told where to come and what to ask for. A community that had kept its books quietly for 13 centuries had just been advertised. He went back in 1853 and was shown nothing. He seems to have concluded that the manuscript had been dispersed or hidden, possibly because he had made too much noise about the value of the first 43 leaves. Then, in 1859, he went a third time, and this visit was different in a way that matters enormously to the argument about what happened next. He went as the guest of the Tsar of Russia. Alexander II was the protector of the Orthodox churches of the East, and St. Catherine's is an Orthodox monastery. A scholar arriving with the Tsar's patronage was not simply a visitor with an interest in old books. He arrived carrying the weight of the most powerful Orthodox ruler in the world, at a monastery that depended on Russian goodwill, and that was at that moment in the middle of a disputed election for its own leadership. The story of what happened is famous. On the evening before he was due to leave, Tischendorf mentioned his interest to the steward, and the steward said he had a copy of the Septuagint himself, and produced from his cell a bundle wrapped in a red cloth. Inside it was the manuscript. Tischendorf sat up all night with it. He later wrote that he could not sleep, and that it seemed to him sacrilege to sleep at all. He had been looking for 15 years. He had crossed the desert 3 times. He had convinced himself on the second visit that the book was gone, and now a man he had been making small talk with had produced it from his own room, wrapped in a cloth, as a thing he happened to own. Whatever you make of what he did next, that night is one of the great moments in the history of scholarship, and he knew exactly what he was holding while it was happening. It is also, if you are being unkind, the moment the story starts to be told by one participant. Everything we know about that evening comes from Tischendorf's own pen, written up long afterwards, for an audience in Europe that wanted a hero. What happened over the following weeks is where the accounts separate, and where a story about a book becomes a story about a document. Tischendorf's version is that the monastery agreed to send the manuscript to the Tsar as a gift, in gratitude for his protection, and that the transfer was made properly and with consent. There is a receipt. He signed one when the manuscript was handed over for him to take to Cairo to copy, and it says in terms that the book was a loan and would be returned. The monastery's version is that a loan is what it was, and that a loan does not become a gift because the borrower prefers it that way. The community was without a confirmed leader at the time, which is precisely when an institution cannot lawfully give away its greatest treasure. The monks say the pressure of the Russian connection made refusal impossible in practice, whatever was written down. The detail that carries the most weight is the leadership. St. Catherine's is headed by an archbishop, and at exactly this moment, the community was in the middle of a contested succession, with the appointment unresolved and the monks divided. Nobody had clear authority to dispose of anything, and everybody knew that the Russian court would have a say in who was eventually confirmed. Put those two facts side by side. A community with no confirmed head, whose next head would need Russian approval, is asked by the Tsar's own emissary for its greatest possession. There is no need to imagine a threat. In a situation like that, nothing has to be said at all. There is a later deed of gift, produced in 1869, 10 years after the manuscript had already gone to Russia, and long after it was going to come back. Whether a document signed a decade after the fact, by a monastery in that position, records a free gift or ratifies a fait accompli is exactly the question, and it is the reason this is still argued about in print today. Here is the fairest thing that can be said. Tischendorf did not steal the manuscript in the night. He also did not obtain it the way a modern museum would need to obtain it, and he benefited at every stage from an imbalance of power he did not create, but did not decline to use. Both institutions still hold their positions, politely and permanently. The British Library's account is that the manuscript came to it by purchase from the Soviet government in good faith for a very large sum, and that it has cared for it and made it freely available ever since. The monastery's account is that a loan was never returned, that no deed signed a decade later under those conditions can cure that, and that the leaves it still holds are the proof of what it always said about its own library. Neither of those is a lie. They are two true accounts of different stretches of the same journey, and the reason the argument never ends is that nobody in it has to be dishonest for it to continue. The manuscript went to St. Petersburg, and then Tischendorf did the thing that, whatever else you conclude about him, no thief would ever do. He published it. The edition came out in 1862, timed for the 1000th anniversary of the Russian Empire, and it was a magnificent piece of printing. Type was cut specially to imitate the shapes of the 4th century letters. The layout reproduced the 4 columns. Line for line, page for page, a scholar in Oxford or Tübingen could now read a 4th century Bible without ever leaving home. That single act changed the study of the New Testament permanently, and it is the strongest thing in Tischendorf's defense. A man who wanted the book for himself would have kept its readings to himself. He gave them to everybody who could read Greek immediately, in the most legible form the printing technology of his century could produce. And then history did something nobody in 1859 could have planned for. The Russian Revolution replaced the Tsar with a government that had no religious use for a Christian Bible, and a very pressing need for foreign currency. In 1933, the Soviet Union sold the Codex Sinaiticus to the British Museum for £100,000. That was an enormous sum in 1933, in the depths of a depression, and it was the largest amount ever paid for a book at that time. The British government put up half of it. The other half was raised by public subscription, which is to say that ordinary people in Britain, in a year when a great many of them had nothing, sent in what they could to buy a Bible for the nation. The appeal asked for small contributions and got them from parishes and schools and individuals, and the money came in. It arrived in London just before Christmas, and it has been on public display ever since, now in the British Library, where anyone can walk in off the street and look at it without paying anything. There is something worth sitting with in that sequence. An atheist state sold a Bible it did not want to a country that raised the money for it in shillings, and the result was that the oldest complete New Testament in the world ended up in a free public gallery rather than a private collection. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel, and there is a new one every day, walking through the life of Jesus. So the book that was made in one place is now in 4. The largest part, the great majority of the New Testament, is in London. The 43 leaves Tischendorf took in 1844 are in Leipzig. A small number of leaves and fragments remained in St. Petersburg, and some of it is still at St. Catherine's. That last part is the piece of the story almost nobody knows, and it is the best thing that has happened to this manuscript in a century. In 1975, work at the monastery uncovered a sealed room beneath a chapel that had been closed off after a fire long before. Inside were thousands of manuscript fragments and whole codices that had lain there untouched in the dry dark for centuries. Scholars call them the new finds, and they are one of the great manuscript discoveries of the 20th century in their own right, quite apart from what else was in there. Because among them were leaves of the Codex Sinaiticus. Think about what that does to the basket. The monastery had not burned its parchment. It had walled it up, which is what a community does with damaged holy books that it will not destroy. The leaves that had been missing for 130 years were exactly where the monks had always said their manuscripts were, in the monastery kept. And then, in 2009, something happened that would have astonished every person in this story. The 4 institutions holding the Codex agreed to photograph every surviving leaf at high resolution and publish the whole thing together, free, on the internet. That was harder than it sounds, and not only technically. It required the British Library, a German university, a Russian national library, and an Orthodox monastery in Egypt. 4 parties who do not agree about who ought to own the thing to cooperate on a single project for years. They did it by setting the ownership question aside rather than settling it. Everybody kept their leaves and their opinions, and the book was made whole in the only place it could be. They also photographed each page twice, once in flat light and once raked across the surface from the side, so that the impressions left by a dry pen and the ghosts of erased letters show up as shadows. A reader today can see things on those pages that Tischendorf, working by lamplight with the original in his hands, could not. The manuscript is now reunited, not physically, and there is no sign that the ownership argument will ever be settled to everyone's satisfaction. But anybody with a connection can now open the Codex Sinaiticus at any page, see the 4 columns, see the corrections in their different inks, and read the oldest complete New Testament in the world from a chair at home. A book that took a herd of animals and years of skilled labor to produce, that was worth a house, that was guarded for 1,500 years in a desert and fought over for 150 more, is now free to everybody, everywhere, forever. That is worth pausing on, because it is the only part of this entire story that everybody involved would have wanted. The scribes made a book to be read. The monks kept a book to be read. Tischendorf published so it could be read. The people who sent shillings in 1933 were buying something for the nation to read. Four parties who agree on nothing else all wanted the same outcome, and after 1,600 years, it finally arrived. Now, what does it actually say? This is the part people brace for, because they have heard that the oldest manuscripts differ from the Bible on their shelf, and they are not sure what to do with that. So let us go through it plainly and without drama, because the honest answer is more reassuring than the rumor. The differences are real, they are small, they are well known, and your Bible almost certainly already tells you about them in a footnote. Take the ending of Mark. In most modern Bibles, Mark's Gospel runs to chapter 16, verse 20, and there is a note somewhere on the page saying that the earliest manuscripts end at verse 8. Sinaiticus is one of those manuscripts. In it, Mark stops with the women at the empty tomb, afraid, and that is the end of the book. Nothing is being hidden from anybody. The footnote in the Pew Bible and the manuscript in the British Library are saying exactly the same thing, and they have been saying it in public for 150 years. Take the account of the woman brought to Jesus by men demanding she be stoned, and the line about the one without sin casting the first stone. It is one of the most loved passages in the Gospels. It is not in Sinaiticus, and it is not in the other oldest manuscripts, and again, your Bible will have a note saying so. What does a Christian do with that? A great many faithful scholars have thought about it, and the usual answer is that a passage can be an entirely true account that circulated on its own and was written into the Gospel of John later, in the place where it fitted best. That is a claim about how a book was assembled, not a claim about whether something happened. There is a further clue in the manuscripts themselves that supports exactly that reading. Where the passage does appear in later copies, it does not always appear in the same place. Some manuscripts put it at the end of John. Some put it in Luke. A passage that moves around is a passage that was traveling on its own before it settled, which is precisely what you would expect of a remembered incident that everyone knew and nobody had yet fixed in a book. And it is worth being clear about the size of the whole business, because the rumor always makes it sound larger than it is. Set every difference between the oldest manuscripts and a modern Bible side by side, and the overwhelming majority are spellings, word order, a name written in full where another copy abbreviates it, and the eye jumps we talked about earlier. The passages substantial enough to be worth a footnote in your Bible can be counted on your fingers, and your Bible prints those footnotes. Nothing in the Codex Sinaiticus threatens a single article of the Creed. There is no secret gospel in it, no different Jesus, no missing doctrine. It is the same faith, written out by hand 1,600 years ago by people who believed it. And now the far larger point, which gets almost no attention because it is not dramatic. Set a 4th century Bible beside a Bible printed this year, in 2 different languages, separated by 1,600 years and every upheaval that happened in between, and they are the same book. The same 4 Gospels in the same order, the same letters of Paul. The same account of the birth, the ministry, the arrest, the cross and the empty tomb. Not a similar book, the same one. If you had told a skeptical historian in advance that a text copied by hand for 16 centuries would arrive essentially intact, they would not have believed you. That is not what happens to hand-copied texts. It is what happened to this one, and Sinaiticus is a large part of how we know. So go back to the question, now that you have the whole of it. Was it a rescue, or was it a taking? Here is the case that it was a rescue. Before Tischendorf, the manuscript sat unread. Nobody outside a few monks knew what it was. He identified it, he understood its age, he published it, and within a decade every scholar in Europe could study a 4th century Bible. If he had walked past that library, the book might still be sitting in the dark, and it might have been in that walled-up room when the roof came down. And here is the case that it was a taking. The monks had kept it safe for 1500 years without any help, which is a longer record of preservation than any museum on earth can show. They did not ask to be rescued. The receipt says loan. The visitor had an emperor behind him, and the community had no confirmed leader. And a gift made under those conditions is a gift, the way a signature at a border is a free choice. You can hold both. Most people who know this story well do. What Tischendorf did was of enormous service to scholarship, and it was done in a way that the people who owned the book have never accepted, and both of those sentences are true at once. But there is a third thing, and it is the note this ought to end on. The manuscript survived all of it. It survived the Roman Empire that produced it and the empire that bought it. It survived the fire at the monastery and the revolution in Russia and a sale by a government that despised what it said. It survived being cut into 4 pieces across 4 countries, and it survived 150 years of argument about who had the right to hold it. And the men who wrote it were not thinking about any of that. They were sitting in a room in the 4th century with a pot of ink and a stack of prepared skin, copying out a sentence at a time, checking each other's work, and going back to fix what they had got wrong. We do not know a single one of their names. Nothing in the book tells us who they were, where the room was, or who paid for the hides. They left no dedication and signed nothing. The only trace of them is the shape of their letters, the places where they were tired, and the corrections they made when they caught themselves. It is a strange kind of monument. 400 surviving leaves in 4 countries on the internet, arguments in 3 languages about who ought to have it, and at the bottom of all of it, a few anonymous men doing careful work they expected nobody to notice. Everything else in this story is what happened to their book. What they did was make sure it was right.